Speaker this afternoon is Mrs. Elizabeth Kirk. She is an independent scholar who writes and speaks in various areas of family law and religious freedom, with a special interest in adoption law and policy. She provides strategic guidance such as legislative analysis on related matters to policy leaders and legislators. Mrs. Kirk holds a Juris Doctor, magna cum laude, from Notre Dame Law School and a bachelor's degree in English literature, which she obtained from the University of Missouri. She has both practiced and taught law and is a member of the Catholic Women's Forum at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. She'll speak today on the what can Humanae Vitae teach us about the Cross of Infertility. Welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers, especially Archbishop Chaput and Teresa Notare and the other organizers. As we've seen over the last few days, many focus on the hard teachings of Humanae Vitae, especially as it relates to the widespread practice and acceptance of contraception. But in my remarks, I'd like to offer some reflections, not as a lawyer or as an academic, but from the lived experience of infertility, a cross that my husband and I have carried throughout our 14 years of marriage and have been blessed to benefit from the science that was so wonderfully described this morning. I hope to demonstrate the beauty and the consolation of the message of Humana Vitae, that all married couples are called to live deeply and intentionally the vocation of marital fruitfulness. Before turning to Humana Vitae itself, I just want to offer a few thoughts on the nature of the cross of infertility. As Dr. Duane pointed out, the modern mind thinks of fertility as a disease, but it's actually infertility. It's the disordered condition. And there are significant physiological, emotional, psychological, and even social aspects to the experience. Infertile women experience equivalent levels of anxiety and depression as women with diagnoses of cancer, HIV status, or heart disease. There's much to be said about all of these dimensions, and what I want to do is something a little different, which is to focus on the perspective from Scripture, and then also to make some observations about the particular way the cross of infertility affects men and women and in marriage, drawing on some thoughts of John Paul II. In Scripture, fruitfulness is both a command, be fruitful and multiply, and a blessing, and it contains ample evidence of the deep sorrow that attends the cross of infertility. The words of Rachel capture the depth of the grief so well: "Give me children, or I shall die." The barren womb is often depicted as a curse. For example, when King Saul disobeyed God by offering an unlawful sacrifice, Samuel pronounced God's judgment upon him, that his kingdom would not continue, and that another man, after God's own heart, would rule instead, and his kingdom would never end. This new king, David, took as his first wife Saul's daughter, Michal. And when David brought the ark to Jerusalem, Michal observed him dancing before the ark, and despising him in her heart, she mocked him. The passage concludes, Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. Perhaps her barrenness was a personal curse, but the more important aspect of the story, I think, is that her sterility demonstrated the fulfillment of God's providential plan. Because she and David had no offspring, Saul's descendants, through her, would never be part of the eternal house of David, as Samuel had prophesied. God closes and opens the womb for his own purpose. Indeed, upon scrutiny, barrenness as curse does not seem to be the primary role of infertility in Scripture. Most of the barren women of Scripture were virtuous women, and to my knowledge, all of them conceive, save Michal. Rather, infertility, especially in the cases of women past menopause, provides the occasion for God's purposeful intervention in perpetuating his people in difficult or even impossible circumstances, and demonstrates his faithfulness to his covenant and the plan he has for them, which will culminate in the miraculous conception and birth of Christ. The motif of the childless couple and God's purposeful, miraculous intervention permeates the entire narrative history of the Jewish people. In each of the cases of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel and Leah, Manoah and his wife, Elkanah and Hannah, the Shunammite couple, and Zechariah and Elizabeth, God opened and closed the womb to accomplish his divine plan. For nothing is impossible with God. Couples who struggle with infertility might find solace in meditating upon the scriptural stories of these couples. Indeed, what a privilege it is to carry the cross that played such a role in salvation history. On the other hand, these stories can be discouraging because, except for Michal, they all conceived. And sadly, many couples are never able to conceive or carry to term a child. This cross weighs heavily on the man, on the woman, and on them both as a couple. Because our bodies carry within them the potential for motherhood and fatherhood, infertility also damages one's understanding of one's own masculinity or femininity. Men stand outside the biological processes of pregnancy and childbirth, and as John Paul described in Mulieris Dignitatem, in many ways they learn their fatherhood from the woman. Nevertheless, they suffer deeply from the cross of infertility. Abraham cried aloud to God, "What will you give, for I continue childless?" When it is the case that infertility is caused by the man's particular physiological difficulty, his own sterility may cause him feelings of insecurity as he suffers deeply, not because he is unable to provide for his family, but because he is literally unable to provide a family. And yet, I think the cross of infertility necessarily and deeply plays out on the woman in a particular way. The absence of pregnancy or the inability to conceive never shows on a man in the way that it is repeatedly visited upon the woman, whose belly is never swollen with new life, and who is reminded repeatedly by her body that she is, for yet another month, not pregnant. According to Pope John Paul, the ability to conceive and bear children gives rise to woman's particular feminine genius, that is, her special ability to give and receive the human person in love. And although he's careful to say this is not limited to an exclusively biophysiological interpretation of women, this physical capacity does reveal an important aspect of our vocation, motherhood. And so to be unable to conceive and give birth is the occasion not only for deep emotional or psychological sadness, but also a more fundamental anguish regarding your worth as a woman. Infertility can affect women in another very particular way. John Paul II cautioned that the woman had to take care that her sensitivity to others does not succumb to the temptation to possessive selfishness. This tendency, in the context of infertility, can become a possessive desire to have children, to think of them as objects to which one is entitled, rather than as a gift, a unique person, which one receives. According to Proverbs, the barren womb is never satisfied. The lure of assisted reproductive technologies reinforces this temptation to view the child as object and to idolize parenthood, and treats the man and the woman as instruments toward the production of the child. The child produced through IVF is treated from her conception as an interchangeable, fungible, and ultimately disposable commodity, rather than as a unique and beloved human person who ought to be the fruit of her parents' mutual love. Such a method combines the worst aspects of technological proficiency and a consumerist mentality and preys upon the very natural and good desire for children while doing nothing to identify or treat the underlying causes of infertility. In addition to infertility's effect on men and women individually, the cross strikes to the very heart of the vocation to married life. Because children are the visible sign of a married couple's union, the two become one literally, the very act that is ordered toward new life can come to feel sterile, selfish, or even pointless. Just as Humanae Vitae predicted that contraception would cause a reduction of one's spouse to an object of pleasure, a focus on fertility can reduce one's spouse to a means to have children. Marriage is meant to create a space for others, specifically for a child, and the emptiness of that space can threaten to rob the marriage of meaning. Also, differences of modes of communication between men and women can pose a special challenge for husbands and wives in these circumstances. Again, Scripture provides us with glimpses into these aspects of the cross. For example, infertility causes Rachel and Jacob to turn on each other. Out of envy at her sister Leah's fertility, Rachel cries out to her husband, demanding that he give her children. Jacob responds to her in frustration and blame. Am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? In another case, infertility creates a gulf of misunderstanding and loneliness between spouses. Elkanah had two wives, Peninnah, who had children, and Hannah, who had none. Hannah grieved her infertility bitterly, and her husband, although he loved her deeply, could not understand the depth of her sorrow. He said, "Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons?" The answer was clearly no, as she went alone to the temple, deeply distressed, and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. Finally, carrying the cross of infertility requires both spouses to trust in God's providential plan when all seems hopeless, and this is hard to do. Recall the story of Abraham and Sarah, who were promised descendants as numerous as the stars. When the promise was not fulfilled, after waiting for 10 long years, Sarah and Abraham took the matter of the promise into their own hands, seeking to fulfill it by their own actions. Without the benefit of modern reproductive technologies, Sarah gave Abraham her slave woman, Hagar, and by her he had a son, Ishmael. And yet, this child was not deemed to fulfill the covenantal promise in his or in God's eyes, demonstrating that the blessing of procreation is not simply a matter of generation of biological children, but rather has a more capacious meaning involving cooperation with God's plan. So I'd now like to turn to Humana Vitae and the message it might hold for those carrying this cross. The heart of Humanae Vitae's teaching about marriage is that it is a communion of persons, a unity that gives life, is procreative. It is especially important to understand the authentic meaning of Christian marriage and to get it right, for, as Archbishop Chaput said last night in his homily, it signifies the covenant between Christ and his church. And so much of what I could say here was stated much more beautifully yesterday by the philosophers and today by Professor McCarthy. And so I don't want to wade into some of those deep philosophical discussions, as important as they are. So I just want to quickly review a few general principles that I think are points of agreement that I take as received tradition in order to make my larger point. The teaching of Humana Vitae that each and every marriage act must remain ordained to the transmission of life is based, says Blessed Pope Paul VI, upon the inseparable connection between the two meanings of the conjugal act, union and procreation. The conjugal act manifests that the reality of conjugal love exists, and this reality is this: any act of human sexual intercourse can be subjectively affective rather than unitive, and or biologically generative rather than procreative. But only a conjugal act expresses the full meaning of marriage because it is the only sort of act that joins together a man and a woman in a union marked by fidelity and exclusivity and fecundity. So when a married couple engages in contraception, the sexual act may express intimacy, and it may be effective, and it might even produce a child if contraception fails. But it is not unitive or procreative in the conjugal sense. John Paul II described it this way: when the conjugal act is deprived of its inner truth because it is deprived artificially of its procreative capacity, it also ceases to be an act of love. The contraceptive act doesn't signify the relationship between Christ and his church. The creation of a child in a lab through IVF doesn't signify the relationship between Christ and his church. Again, those acts might be effective, they might be generative, but they're not unitive and procreative. There are those we know who argue that these teachings, while prophetic and ideal, are difficult and that objective rules cannot govern all the broken circumstances of human relationships. Although falling short of the ideal, contraceptive sex within marriage, according to some, might be permitted for the sake of the marital union, especially if the marital union on the whole is open to life. Obviously, this was explicitly rejected in Humana Vitae. But some suggest still that even where procreation is foreclosed intentionally, the unitive significance of marriage may be preserved, so that even in this admittedly fallen situation, there are constructive elements which are pastorally important. And Janet Smith, of course, covered this very well, so I won't go into it more. But this line of thinking might continue, by analogy, that the conjugal acts of infertile couples, or the elderly or fertile couples during infertile periods, they might say, demonstrate that spouses can still experience the full unitive meaning of the conjugal act without the possibility of procreation. But I think this requires the conclusion that the unitive and procreative meanings can be separated without harm to the other, and suggests for the infertile couple that their conjugal acts, although unitive, are not procreative, merely because they are not generative of biological children. And the beauty of Humanae Vitae is that conjugal love expressed fully and faithfully always carries with it both of its meanings. It is unifying and fruitful. The conjugal acts of infertile couples are not empty or meaningless. Rather, the Catechism states, spouses to whom God has not granted children can nevertheless have a conjugal life full of meaning in both human and Christian terms. Their marriage can radiate a fruitfulness of charity, of hospitality, and of sacrifice. Despite the heaviness and special suffering associated with the cross of infertility, this reality provides great comfort and consolation for infertile couples because it affirms that their conjugal acts are not only unitive but remain procreative in a real sense. The Church, in her maternal wisdom, affirms repeatedly that the conjugal union of infertile couples remains fruitful and gives concrete suggestions for ways in which fecundity might manifest itself within an individual marriage. For example, John Paul II stated in Familiaris Consortio that physical sterility, in fact, can be for spouses the occasion for other important services to the life of the human person. For example, adoption, various forms of educational work, and assistance to other families and to poor or handicapped children. At times, this is phrased in terms of spiritual parenthood, a concept most commonly used in the context of religious and priests. I want to suggest that we need to go further. However, in the case of married men and women, while husbands and wives may exercise a sort of spiritual parenthood together or individually, marital fruitfulness is something qualitatively different than spiritual parenthood and is integrally tied up with the spousal love itself. As Pope Francis pointed out in Amoris Laetitia, children are not merely entitled to the individual love of each parent, of a mother and a father, but to their mutual love for one another. And the fruitfulness of this mutual love is, in the context of infertility, is not a second-best sort of parenthood, like, well, you can't be real parents, but you can be spiritual parents. The understanding of marriage elucidated in Humana Vitae allows infertile couples to understand that their marriages, like all marriages, are ordered toward union and fecundity. And to be sure, fecundity is realized in its fullest sense through a biological child. But even in that case, fruitfulness does not end with the conception of a child through the conjugal act. The procreative meaning of marriage has always had an expansive meaning signifying both the conception and the upbringing of children. As Professor Burzhevsky says, we are not mere guppies. In Gaudium et Spes, the Council Fathers considered the interrelatedness of the two meanings of marriage in the case of married couples who find themselves in circumstances where, at least temporarily, the size of their family should not be increased, warning that where the intimacy of married life is broken off, its faithfulness can sometimes be imperiled and its quality of fruitfulness ruined, for then the upbringing of the children and the courage to accept new ones are both endangered. This passage makes clear that fruitfulness in marriage involves both the conception and the upbringing of children, and that to endanger the quality of fruitfulness is not simply to foreclose the possibility of conceiving new children, but implicates negatively the upbringing of existing children who are part of the conjugal union. Indeed, the Church teaches that the conjugal union is the only one that adequately safeguards the dignity of the child in terms of her origin, but also because of her upbringing. Marriage forms the foundation society, as ought to be reflected in law, as Helen Alvarez notes so persuasively, not only because it is the best place for a child to be born, but because it's also the best place for a child to grow up. As John Paul II said in Familiaris Consortio, the fruitfulness of conjugal love is not restricted solely to the procreation of children, even understood in its specifically human dimension. It is enlarged and enriched by all those fruits of moral, spiritual, and supernatural life which the father and mother are called to hand on to their children, and through the children to the church and to the world. And far from being a strict materialist concept, then, marital fruitfulness is expansive. So, I think we can say that when a married couple welcomes into their home and raises a child through adoption, this child is, in some important sense, the fruit of his adoptive parents' conjugal love. As Pope Francis stated in Amoris Laetitia, the choice of adoption and foster care expresses a particular kind of fruitfulness in the marriage experience, and he urges even those with biological children to find other expressions of fruitfulness that in some way prolong the love that sustains them. Christian marriages are fruitful, he exhorts, by their witness of fraternity, their social concern, their outspokenness on behalf of the underprivileged, their luminous faith, and their active hope. So in some important and real sense, as Humanae Vitae makes clear, conjugal love is always fecund, and therefore spouses should be encouraged to look beyond the particular experience of the suffering of infertility to discern how their particular marriage is called to bear fruit. To be sure, the breach between the Church's clear teaching on contraception, as well as the corollary practices like IVF, and the widespread acceptance and practice of those by Catholics, presents an enormous pastoral challenge and a special task to account faithfully and winsomely, as Professor Collette put it last night, for the teaching in a way that touches the human heart. But the perspective of the infertile couple helps us to understand why it is so important to uphold the fullness of the teachings in Humana Vitae and to resist temptations to pick apart the wholeness and integrity of its teaching on the interrelatedness of conjugal love and the good of creation. In closing, I want to offer a few practical reflections. There is much that could be said about the pastoral response to the suffering of couples who struggle with infertility, and there are many existing and worthy initiatives that seek to address it. One limitation, I think, is that many initiatives focus largely on supporting couples who are going through infertility treatments or who have turned to adoption, and I think more could be done for those couples who are or who will remain childless. And I've tried to suggest that a faithful interpretation of Humanae Vitae, especially a robust appreciation for the fruitfulness of all marriages, provides great consolation to couples who struggle with this cross. But I do have 4 additional points to suggest. First, special attention should be paid to infertility as an occasion for husband and wife to grow closer together through their shared suffering, especially because it goes to the heart of the marital vocation and involves marital intimacy. We heard yesterday a question from Mary Hassan about those who struggle with fertility, with practicing NFP and with the reality of large families. And from the perspective of the infertile couple, it's very difficult to experience the pregnancies of women who do not appreciate their fertility or who get pregnant just very easily despite unhealthy lifestyles or poor moral choices, or to understand why there are so many abortions when a million abortions when you just desire one child. And it can be very tempting to just take one egg and one sperm with your husband and create one child, right? Isn't that the pro-life thing to do? I've been asked many times. Those go to the heart of the marriage, and Humanae Vitae tells us that conjugal love is total. That is to say, it's a very special form of personal friendship in which husband and wife generously share everything, and infertility is a particular opportunity to show this friendship to one's spouse with all of his or her weaknesses or defects, including physical infertility, and to share together this suffering with Christ, who is the source of all spiritual fruitfulness. Couples should be encouraged to know, as Pope Benedict described in Spe Salvi, that it is not by sidestepping or fleeing from suffering that we are healed, but rather by our capacity for accepting it, maturing through it, and finding meaning through union with Christ, who suffered with infinite love. Finally, couples should be encouraged to seek refuge and strength together in the sacraments. As Pope Francis stated in Amoris Laetitia, if this love is to overcome all trials and remain faithful in the face of everything, it needs the gift of grace to strengthen it. Second, pastors should encourage couples that acceptance of this suffering does not negate hope. This is particularly difficult in the context of infertility because the structure of the reproductive cycle is such that each month your hopes are raised and then dashed anew. So maintaining hope as a practical matter can be quite difficult. Pope Benedict described hope as not yet fulfillment, hope that gives us courage to place ourselves on the side of the good even in seemingly hopeless situations. Here again, a biblical story is illustrative. When Hannah went to the temple, she was weeping so bitterly, moving her lips silently in prayer, that the priest Eli thought she was drunk. When she told him, without detail, that she'd been imploring God in her sorrow, he replied, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition which you have made to him." Remarkably, she immediately went her way and ate, and her countenance was no longer sad. Without any sure evidence, she had hope that her prayer had been heard and would be answered, although she knew not how. Not every infertile couple will have their prayers answered in the way that Hannah did with the birth of a son, but when Hannah went away in peace, she did not know this would be her outcome either. When a couple places themselves on the side of the good, even in the hopeless case of infertility, they express a hope that fruitfulness may come in many ways. The emptiness that they may feel is present in their conjugal life can be transformed by hope to a space that can be filled by God. Third, pastors should consider that couples who carry the painful cross of infertility serve as silent witnesses against the culture of contraception and in support of the hard teachings of Humanae Vitae. An ironic aspect of the cross of infertility, given the high rate of contraceptive use, is that many people assume infertile couples are contracepting, and therefore childless by choice. Additionally, pastors often understandably praise large families for their obedience to God's providential plan and their fidelity to church teaching, inadvertently implying that those with small families or no children are unfaithful. They should consider that couples who carry the cross of infertility, and in particular who obey God's plan for procreation in seeking to remedy their infertility, are also witnesses to such fidelity. Throughout salvation history, God has preferred his glory to be revealed through the weak and the insignificant. In today's culture of contraception, abortion, sexual expressionism, the objectification of children, who better to reveal the glory of God's fruitfulness than the barren husband and wife? As the author of the Book of Wisdom stated, better than unrighteousness is childlessness with virtue, for in the memory of virtue is immortality, because it is known both by God and by men. Finally, 1 in 8 women suffer from infertility or impaired fertility. So this is happening in your community, in your parish, in your community. So here are 5 quick practical steps you can take next week when you get home in the context of your parish life or your diocesan programs, etc., if you're not already, to support infertile couples. First, teach about it. Unlike the well-known, reviled teaching on contraception, many good and well-meaning Catholics have no idea what the Church's teaching on reproductive technologies is. And so when they face this cross, they follow their doctor's advice, which is typically to go down a route that we wouldn't recommend. So include the possibility of infertility and the Church's pastoral response to it in marriage preparation courses, as well as the more expansive notion of fruitfulness in marriage, and challenge married couples, so beyond marriage prep, challenge married couples to live this expansive notion of fruitfulness. We might ask, for example, how can there be almost 120,000 foster children waiting right now in this country to be adopted when there are Christian couples called to fruitfulness? Second, host an event, sponsor a morning or evening of prayer with Mass, or even a day-long retreat with speakers such as couples, doctors, theologians, who can place the cross of infertility within the larger context of the spiritual life. Third, support. Start a support group within your diocese or your parish, but also identify couples that can serve as mentors. This is such a deeply personal and painful cross that many people don't feel comfortable going to a support group. But if you can put them in touch with another couple who is carrying the same cross, that can be an enormous consolation to them. Fourth, know your resources. There are Facebook groups, there are books, there are church documents, there are counselors, doctors, adoption services. I mean, there's so many resources. And not each one of them, not everyone's going to read Humana Vitae and Donum Vitae, and but so you need to know your breadth of resources to be able to minister to couples. Fifth, preach about it, talk about it, but do so with sensitivity. An example, a lovely example, I think, was at last night's Mass. There was a prayer intention for all of those who are struggling with infertility. In my former parish in South Bend, some of you may know who Monsignor Michael Heinz was. He was very sensitive to this. He would pray, for example, on Mother's and Father's Day for all those whose vocation was motherhood and fatherhood, so as not to exclude those who were called to motherhood but yet had not yet experienced it. And this is the topic of a whole nother talk, but educate yourself on the way to talk about it. So, for example, don't say to an infertile couple, well, you can always adopt, or if they do adopt, don't say, well, now you'll probably get pregnant with your own child. There's a whole what not to say talk I could give, but so in closing, ultimately, the teachings of Humanae Vitae represent the teachings of Christianity just generally regarding suffering, and also hope and joy, but in the specific context of marriage. The task of fruitfulness belongs to every Christian, and infertility is simply one example of the way in which our human suffering can bear spiritual fruit. In some sense, we can say that the paradox of the barren bearing fruit is the story of salvation itself, giving hope not just to infertile couples, but to all of us seeking to defend this most despised of church teachings. In the closing passage of Habakkuk, the prophet looks forward to the day when the oppressor of the Jewish people will be destroyed. He praises God, though nothing has yet happened, and though all looks barren and desolate, because he trusts the one who is faithful to his promises. Quote, "Though the fig tree does not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation." Thank you.